revenue streaming, classical music, and the quest for digital and streaming sales. And we've got 45 minutes, and hopefully it will be entertaining but also interesting. We hope that it's more the context of serious academic debate rather than simply an infomercial. I'm sure that there are going to be some questions generated, and please hold them to the end. We'll set aside some time at the end of our session. We have a total of 45 minutes, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. So, without further ado, if I could just ask my colleagues on the panel to briefly introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Will Hope. I'm Director of Labour Relations at Spotify for Europe. I've been at the company for 3.5 years and focus on obviously working with labels and the music industry to make the most out of Spotify and add as much value to your activities as we possibly can.
Hi, my name is STEPHAN. I'm working for Deutsche Grammophon. I'm Director of Digital Media and worked before for Universal Music, Classics and Jazz, same position. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jonathan GRUBER, Managing Director of Ulysses Arts. I work in consulting in digital and classical music.
I'm Robert von BAHR, more known as Robert von Bies, and I am then the Managing Director of the eponymous record company, and also Chairman of the board of eClassical.com, which is a downloading site.
Thank you. So as we recall, this is from the abstract of today's conference, and these are really a number of questions that we're going to be going through and hopefully have some animated discussion about. We had a dress rehearsal this morning, and for me it was very interesting and illuminating to hear a variety of perspectives and insights that our illustrious colleagues on the panel have. Before we begin, I'd just like to put things in context a bit, and especially this context of classical music. There was a recent article that you can see in Fortune magazine, the American business magazine, which actually talks about the penetration of smartphones in today's world, has a portable music device. And it actually compares it, as you can see, to things like radio tape players in the 80s and 90s, CD players of all time, which really peaked just after 2000. And you can see that in terms of millions of units, it almost reached 60 million units sold. But in a very, very short few years, and really about 8 years, with the introduction of the smartphone, as you can see, I wasn't able to put this only on one slide. The red peak of the smartphones goes up to 130 million in just a short amount of time. And the focus of this Fortune article was talking about how people are now listening to music, how they're listening to recorded music. So iTunes will pass the 100 billion download mark this year. But what's also interesting is that other content, not only music of all genres, but also video and book revenues are rising considerably more. And one of the provocative questions that the Fortune magazine article answers or asks is, does Apple have a streaming problem? So we don't want to bombard you with statistics, but just to get a start, we're going to be talking also about the creative aspect of recorded music. But just to put some things in perspective, according to the IFPI report in 2012, 34% of global recorded music sales were digital. Of those, 70% downloads and 10% paid subscriptions. 20% other is a variety of formats, also income from YouTube, a variety of content vehicles. And I think at this point, maybe Stefan, you'd like to add some things.
Yeah, we talked about this figure this morning, and I think the digital percentage is not true for all countries, because there are some countries like Germany, for example, where we have only 20% digital share. And talking about the classical world, you know that it's much less. In fact, it's only 5% of the revenue in Germany, for example. So there's still a long way to go. Of course, we have exceptions like Sweden, where we have a very strong impact by streaming. Actually, we have collected some figures. It's 48% of the revenues are subscription, And there are also other markets like South Korea, where we have over 40% subscription, France 36%, and then it's getting down and down. In Germany it's 12%, Japan it's only 4%. So you see it's depending really on the markets, so revenue from streaming depends very much on the habits also of the users.
Okay, thank you. So that brings us really to a different kind of question, going back more on the creative side. Do artists still need labels, or can they now create direct relationships with these new distribution formats? And maybe, Robert, you'd like to comment on this?
Well, you can't generalize about that, I don't think, but there are certainly some artists who are incredibly internet savvy and know everything about social media and so on. For those kinds of artists, they might even be better off without a label and creating their own channels into the digital market. Generally speaking, though, I would say that a label is good because they have so much experience and so much knowledge about what they are doing that they can help the artists to create their own market share. But you can't generalize. I mean, certain artists can do it themselves, certainly can't.
Okay, Will, would you like to weigh in on this one?
Yeah, I think I agree with that, really. I think what digital's done, and now streaming services like Spotify, which are very socially enabled, or, and social is at the heart of what we're doing. And it just, from my perspective, just removes many, many barriers between the artist and a fan of that particular artist. And that means that it's far easier to engage on an almost daily basis, and that's a great way to find old music or also kind of break new music as well. And sort of like Robert was saying, it's, there's different people will be experts then within that field. Labels on the whole would have more experience in that. But there's also a number of artists who are very engaged in this type of thing, who are also very ambitious with what they're trying to do, and they on one occasion might know their audience better than a big label might. But again, it's, it all depends where the expertise lies, really. I think the main thing is that it's now very easy to find a fan base and to keep a kind of constant flow of communication between the artist and fan.
One could also say, if I may insert here, is that the artist, the digital era is creating a huge opportunity for certain artists to do something which they couldn't possibly do before. And that is positive, I think. That's very good.
And Jonathan?
I think that one thing is definitely true, regardless of whether, I agree with Robert, and what Will has said wholeheartedly, which is that there's a lot of opportunities for digital, and actually it depends on the artist, the temperament of the artist. But one thing's for sure, that labels can do an awful lot to help and enable artists to create direct relationships with their listeners. So even if the artist could do it on their own, a lot of times labels should be able to, at least ideally, really take that to another level and work with the artist to make their own direct fan communication as strong as it can possibly be to everyone's benefit. So there's another role there.
Do you think that with the emergence of social networking, that from the consumer, or let's say the listener standpoint, the fan standpoint, is there a greater expectation also of more of a direct contact with the artist that's not filtered through an organization or a company?
I think to a certain extent, yes. I mean, not all artists, not everyone wants to embrace that, and fans sometimes don't want that. I think it's still important for certain artists to have a sort of this air of mysteriousness or mysticism about them. People still want that, but I think, what a lot of social experts would say is, being genuine is obviously key to kind of maintain a successful relationship between a community. So I think it's fairly, I think fans on social networks can quite quickly turn when things don't seem very genuine or organic. So I think, yes, that's important, but it's not necessarily something that works for everyone, but when it does work, I think it can be extremely powerful.
Do you think their expectations are higher in terms of the relationship?
Yeah, you can answer it for sure. I do, yeah. I think that expectations in general in the world, because of social media, and the digital in general, the internet in general, but certainly social media has taken that to another level. The expectation is high that artists will communicate And if they don't, it's sometimes a bit strange. By the way, it's not necessarily a bad thing. If it doesn't suit the artist to communicate, it might be best if they didn't communicate. But on the whole, it's about finding the voice. It's about finding that unique voice in communication in the same way that it's important for artists to find a unique voice in their music. And I think it's just another facet of that, really.
Yeah, I think it depends also very much on the artist himself. For example, we started a video journal with Anne-Sophie Mutter some years back. We would have never expected something like that, and so that also shows that the artists are now opening up even from a more conservative representative part. So actually it's still in development. So I think this, of course, all the young artists we now sign, they have already this attitude and they use already all these channels, and some of these were discovered via YouTube, for example, or via Facebook community that they already bring in. So I think it's still a way to go, and classical music is probably not in the forefront, but we are getting there.
Okay. Well, progressing on to one of the next provocative questions, and it's not by chance that Jonathan is actually sitting between a very significant independent classical music label and a very significant major record label. And perhaps, Jonathan, you'd like to tackle this question about, do independent labels have a competitive advantage over the majors?
Thanks, Tim. The answer to this one, obviously, is of course, I'm going to play it both ways and say both. But I think, but really, taking that, of course, aside of it, I think that digital business, to me, has always been about striking a balance between those two aspects that are traditionally associated with independent labels and major labels. And one very key aspect of that is local versus global. And I think that major labels, on the whole, tend to be, quite frankly, much stronger locally in their activities digitally than independents. A lot of that is down to the structure of the way independent label distribution deals are done. There's usually a separation between physical and digital. There's different mechanisms in place there. And so for independent labels, often I find that it's, there is sometimes a lack of engagement in every single important local territory, whereas the majors tend to be much better at that. But where the majors are weaker often is a centralized approach. I'm not saying that they do, everybody's doing good work, but the majors maybe could do more to centralize and to have a clear communication with digital retail on a global basis. Whereas the independents, I think, do a very good job at the center, but maybe need to get better at that balance and do stuff well locally. Because if you don't do both local and global stuff digitally, you're missing half the picture.
Would anyone like to add to that?
I'll jump in. I guess for us, you know, on streaming services in particular, we see we have no barriers to entry around payment to discover content. That independents can find themselves in a better position just because it's their music is far more readily available. They're not dependent on having, you know, and again, this applies just to music in general, but if, you know, they've got less resources to get their music to radio, they've got less marketing budget. Having just availability there is turning into a good thing for them, and I think most indies can see a higher market share on Spotify than they actually expect elsewhere. And I think that's actually kind of testimony to the kind of meritocratic nature of streaming services, where anyone can find anything. They're not kind of subject to I don't know, editorial in particular, or just, you know, the resources that a major label marketing team might have.
Do you think that ties in with Chris Anderson's writings about the long tail, that perhaps niche labels, even within the niche field of classical music, might have a greater opportunity by having access to a more global audience?
I think streaming makes it a lot easier to find people on a global basis. Obviously, just the distribution cost alone is far less than what it would have been during the physical days. And it's becoming, well, you know, the world is obviously becoming smaller, and that now sounds cliched, and that obviously applies to music too. It's far, far easier to find, you know, fans of a given release in multiple territories simultaneously. And I think that's going to be a big help for people. I
just was going to say that, add to that, and say that on top of that, I think that you can get to a global level of strength as independent or major label with the digital world in a way that you could never do, I think, prior to digital. And that's the revolution here. And that's a huge opportunity just to be able to get to that basic level of having your products available everywhere, pretty much everywhere in the world at any time. And that's amazing. It's then what you do after that. How do you actually take it to the next level? And that sometimes you've got to remember that sales happen in a place. They don't happen out there in the world globally. They happen in a country, in a community. And although these community ties are much more flexible than they used to be, they still exist. So countries are countries, markets are markets.
Yeah, for young artists, for example, and getting the opportunity, for example, to deal with streaming service like Deezer, who's operating in 180 countries. I mean, that has been a dream before for many artists, I guess, and to be available in so many different countries, I think it's a great opportunity. So I think this opens up also the global perspective.
Okay. Well, I have to admit, I hope I'm not telling stories out of school here. This question this morning at our dress rehearsal was quite controversial, and I would actually like to quote a couple of the panel members of some things. You know, with this next question, Robert mentioned, that's opening Pandora's box. And Will clearly stated that these are the kinds of difficult questions that he's paid to deal with. So I'm very curious to have these two gentlemen weigh in particular on this, although also Jonathan and Stefan might want to add to this. Robert, why Pandora's box?
Well, it is a question, I think, not about how much we are getting paid. The labels and the artists are getting paid for streaming services from Spotify. It is a question if and how much it cannibalizes on the normal sales that we could have. And if the streaming would cannibalize, then it would have to be an enormous amount of streaming to actually make up for the loss in sales, physical sales or downloading sales. And I know that from my work in IFPI in Sweden that we are constantly discussing how many streamings should be equivalent to one download. And we are looking at 3 figures. So, I mean, somebody would have to listen to Beethoven's 7th Symphony 100 times in order to make up, or at least 100 times, in order to make up for even one sales or one download. I don't believe that this is the case. I don't think that it is that the proportion of streaming versus download is such now that we are breaking even on this. I believe that actually it is destroying or at least diminishing the returns on other sales. And that is a big problem for at least the classical market. There's another thing as well, and that is that according to the system right now, a stream is a stream is a stream. If the stream is 30 seconds or 31 seconds or 40 minutes, it gets paid the same. And I find that being from the classical business, and we are all here from the classical business because this is ClassicalNEXT, this is a matter of some concern, since the classical tracks, on an average, are much longer than a pop track. That means that we are being discriminated against when it comes to the payment. And that is part of the Pandora's box. I can go on forever, but let my colleague have a say.
Will?
Yeah, this is obviously a contentious issue. I guess part of my job over the years has been to clarify the financial situation and how revenues work with Spotify, because it was something completely different. And one of the issues was people not completely understanding this and immediately being suspicious of it. So that's why it's been a big part of what I do, because and people feeling comfortable with working with us. They want to feel comfortable in knowing that they understand how it works. So that's, I guess, what I was referring to. So we want to avoid comparing streams with downloads and previous physical sales. Not because it's not a favorable comparison, but because it isn't a like-for-like comparison. And this is something that's been said a lot now. But again, when my take on it is that we're always looking for a kind of PPD type equivalent. In physical, the kind of change from physical into digital initially was very much the same model. You had a one-off payment and a one-off purchase and a one-off payment back to the rights holders. Streaming is obviously very, very different, and you can't consider it in the same way, but because those mechanisms of payment have been in place for so long, it's obviously hard to get away from that, and that's obviously completely understandable. So what I try to do, and the way I try to think about it, or help people think about it, is obviously more focus on individual people and look at the average revenue per user. And we don't want to get tied up looking at streams, because that's not really how the finance works. You know, we look at revenue coming in, and then to obviously revenue going out. You know, we're very much a revenue share model. The more money that we can bring as a company, the more money will go out to the music industry. So 70% of everything that comes in goes back out to rights holders. So far, that's been to the tune of $500 million US dollars, and it's something that's growing quickly. If you'd asked me a year ago, I would have said 250. This year alone, we expect to actually pay out another 500 million just in 1 year. So again, it all comes to scale. I think, you know, some of the points made already kind of just refer to, you know, there is an issue, I think, around metadata in particular, how digital music should be delivered, obviously with tracks being that much longer. But on the whole, I mean, our focus is on growing this service, getting more and more people paying to use it, so that we've got more revenue coming in and more revenue going back out to the industry.
Okay, just to perhaps assist some members of the audience that may not be very experienced in calculating income streams from a project like streaming or digital sales. But you were also saying, looking at it from the person perspective, so the consumer that has a premium service that pays $10 or €10 a month, how does that compare with someone that is the occasional downloader or CD purchaser?
Well, I think it has the potential to be far more meaningful, just because it's obviously a monetization period over a far longer period of time. And this is something that again came up this morning, so I'm going to preempt Robert a bit, and he kind of mentioned how he thought in classical music people don't repeat plays that often after they've actually made the initial purchase. Whereas obviously that's key to Spotify. But I think that will change. I think that behaviour will change, as it has done for pop and rock, and I think it's apparent in classical too. On Spotify and streaming services in general, it's very playlist driven. Once you get into a user's playlist, you'll stay there and they'll go back to them. It's particularly premium users who are paying for the service because they will have taken them offline on their mobile phone or tablet device. So we track these things carefully, seeing how products evolve, how products perform, and the kind of the key measures on an individual user basis. So if you get into like a user's playlist, then it's going to stay there, and there'll be a repeat listen over a month, over a year, over several years. That can become more significant than a one-off purchase.
Okay, Stefan, you mentioned this morning, your research has shown that an average classical, and again, excuse the word consumer rather than listener, but let's say consumer of recorded music, that purchases digital downloads or CDs has a lower amount than 120 per year.
It's only around 50 to 60 euros a year, and if you take into account that a streaming subscriber pays 120 euros a year, so it's actually double the fare, and compare this to the buyers of CDs, only 5% buy more than 120 euros a year. So actually, if we compare it really to the other part, then it's a quite small amount of people who really pay so much for music. So actually, it's growing the number of purchase and the amount of money people pay for music in total. Actually, overall, what we didn't discuss so far is that I see it as an additional opportunity to grow the overall business, and that's what we see in many markets, that streaming services are growing the business again, and we had a slight growth after years of decline overall in the overall market. It's very small, but it's a growth again, maybe not for all markets, but globally, and I think that's also the reason needs to be found in streaming services, because we are taking away many young people from looking for it on illegal platforms, and this happened not only in a few markets, but many, and also in European markets. For example, Pirate Bay closed down last year, and in Netherlands they had a growth by more than 60%. So I think there's a great opportunity with streaming models, and this comparison you mentioned, also many artists come to us and they are skeptical about streaming service, and we already prepare some argumentation why it's necessary that they are there. We believe that it's not taking away or cannibalizing the revenues from downloads, and we made an analysis of the 5 most important market, and it's not the case. Streaming is growing the market. It's not cannibalizing downloads. So actually it's a great opportunity, and we need to look at from a longer perspective, because in many countries like Germany, Spotify just started a year ago, and it's in a way not fair comparing both models, which are completely different, and especially the streaming business model is a long-term model. It's really about listening music over and over again, and probably there classical music has an advantage, because classical music stays, not like a pop track which might be out of fashion after a month, and then it's over and nobody listens to it again. But classical music you will listen to in years and years over again. So it's more about engaging the people to use it. So how can we find ways of getting a bigger usage in the streaming services?
Well, that is all very well for somebody to say who is sitting on both pop, rock, and jazz and classical music, and what they lose on the swings they gain on the roundabouts. It's a fair point that people may be spending more money on music. That's true, but we are talking about classical music, and that I don't believe for several reasons. And that is, one of them is that the sound quality still is not really up to it. The second one is the metadata, which Will said something about, which is very difficult to find anything, especially on Spotify. If you want to find a specific recording, it's very difficult to get there in the classical music, because the metadata doesn't actually work hand in hand with the music. But is it really a total coincidence that since Spotify started in Sweden, the number of shops selling music has gone down, and basically it's 0 now? Is it a total coincidence? I don't believe that. And this poses a bit of a problem for classical companies, because there is nowhere we can actually sell our stuff anymore, and therefore, except in downloading, and therefore their shops are gone, and the Spotify doesn't work, so where do we sell? It is not a total coincidence, I believe, and what we have seen in Sweden now, where 59% of the complete Swedish musical market is covered by Spotify alone. 59%. This will happen in Germany too, and then we will see if they are equally happy.
I obviously, need to jump in. I don't think we can, blame Spotify for this. I think this is an overall market trend. What we're proud of is that in Sweden, they've seen growth again for the first time in a decade, and labels are signing more content than ever. Yes, it's being sold in a different way, but I think that's also symptomatic of Sweden as a market had a sort of particularly accelerated evolution towards the access model, having gone, kind of bypassed a kind of mature download market and going from piracy to Spotify. I think we'll see similar trends in a market like the Netherlands, also badly affected by piracy, but now also looking extremely positive because of premium subscriptions in that territory too. So, every market we've been in has grown digitally. Physical decline, I don't think can be pinned to us. We're just, quite frankly, we're not big enough yet.
Okay, certainly many of these topics we could be speaking about for far longer than we really have available. Actually, I'm going to just skip ahead to a question. Clearly, Jonathan, you had some interesting comments on this about digital perhaps being supplanted by streaming. And what about this idea of collectionism? Will classical music in particular give up this idea of the object, the artwork, the notes on the shelf?
I don't know about that. I think that getting information is important and context is important in classical music, and that can be delivered in lots of different ways. But I am definitely skeptical and scared a little bit about losing the idea of collecting and the collecting impulse. And I think that that's something which has been a very important part of the development of the record business for a long time, and it's actually an important part of consumer behavior, and I think we ignored it at our peril. I think that it's very easy to say, it's all going to be about, streaming, or whatever that means. Streaming, is that streaming or is that subscription model? It's difficult to sometimes define these terms, but I think that the ability or the desire for people to collect, to feel ownership about something, that ownership might be a Spotify playlist. But it also might be a download, it might be a CD, it might be an LP. There are all sorts of different ways of feeling ownership. And the notion of ownership might change. But I think that the idea of ownership and the idea of collecting and having a personal stake or stamp on what it is that you listen to, that not only do I think it won't go away, we don't want it to go away. And I think that that's probably also related to some of the things that have been said, I think, about classical. I can't remember where I saw the statistic, but somebody once said that an average classical CD that is bought is listened to less than one time. I can't remember whether that's true or not, but it's sort of it may actually, it rings true for those who have a lot of CDs, who buy a lot of CDs. It's like, I want that, I want that, I want that, and then they think, it all sits on your shelf, and it's like, do I ever listen to that? I don't know, but I have it. And it's books similar, but I think classical music is definitely, having that issue. And I think that the experience of collecting and maybe not listening is something else we have to think about. It's sort of like, I want to own that, but, do I have time to listen to it? I'm not sure. And actually, a lot of revenue has been generated from those types of customers. I'd hate to see that go away.
Actually, the correct figure is that only 11% of all CDs ever produced will ever see the inside of a CD player.
Is it true? There you go.
Jonathan, you alluded to consumer behavior. And clearly, again, from an analytical standpoint, if we think about classical music, recorded classical music consumers has a target audience. We think of them as a market segment. We often associate classical music with somewhat of an elite, an expensive, a luxury product. And if we think about some of the great luxury brands like Louis Vuitton, like Prada, they're actually in the news. They're lobbying in Brussels because they don't want their exclusive products available online through large stores like Amazon or eBay, because they want to protect this exclusivity and this. Stefan, do you see that as a risk for you, that things are going to change?
I don't think it's really comparable to the music business, because, Deutsche Grammophon is a very old brand and has long history, and it's, for us, it's a question, how do we transfer this brand into the digital world? And it's not a question of protecting it to other digital platforms. I think we need these platforms as a business partner to grow our business. And for these kind of brands, they fear the piracy that sometimes the inspectors of the products, they can't even tell the Chinese copies if they are wrong or right. And the shops, the Apple stores in China, which were detected, and so I think there's a great risk for these kind of brands, but we see it not as a risk, we see it as an opportunity. And so actually I believe we will work with them close in future, but not as a competitor, more as a business partner.
Okay.
I don't know, as a distribution channel, I think it's just an interesting question. I think previously a company like Spotify would mainly have been viewed as a sales platform. You'd use a distributor to get there. Whereas I think one of the big shifts now is that platforms like Spotify are actually kind of distributors. You work with them, you can embed players, it's socially kind of dynamic, so it's very easy to get content onto platforms like ours. and it's very easy to get it spread out across the web and then integrated onto other platforms too. So I think just that question alone is very interesting and is representative of a huge shift right now for us. Yeah, our focus is improving ourselves as a kind of platform for discovery and distribution as opposed to creation, which is obviously very much the label's area of expertise.
Okay, in fact, following up on that, after talking about statistics and consumer behavior and strategy, let's come back and talk about the music for a moment, the creative process. And I was downstairs early this afternoon in a very interesting session of people brainstorming about questions very similar to this. And I think this certainly is of interest to young performers and certainly to young composers. And the question is, should musical content adjust to technology?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can see, we talked about this a little bit earlier in our breakfast thing, and one thing that we did definitely, what I thought of was these sort of short classical pieces, like the Max Richter, Sven Helbig, this kind of thing that's going on, where, in a way, the sort of bite-sized length of a downloadable track becomes an interesting new way of thinking about music. So you have Pocket Symphony, in the case of the Sven Helbig record, a very short symphony where a symphonic form is crunched into a very brief period of time, and I think that's interesting. I don't know whether it's going to become a massive new trend, but that certainly is an example of it.
Stefan?
There's another example, the UK single chart, where at the end of the year you even have a TV show, and so actually it's going to a tool.
A classical single chart?
Yeah, the classical single chart, and it's a tool really also to attract new target groups, or probably more crossover, as these formats are perhaps easier to adopt. Yeah, it's an interesting question how far this process will go, and in the music, in the whole production of music.
I mean, even if we think back to the evolution of the symphony orchestra and the development technologically in dealing with metal and working with metal in the 19th century, basically changing the composition of a symphony orchestra with brass instruments becoming more and more of a mainstay. Robert, what about also the element of audio quality in technology?
Well, that is what I was referring to earlier. I mean, the time is almost up now anyway, so I'd like to conclude what I have to say in the following. That is that, of course, I sit here like an old geezer and being quite negative about everything. That is not my intention, really, because the streaming is here, and it's irrevocable, and we have to just find a way to live with it. And the thing is that, as far as I'm concerned, being from the classical world, it would be really important if Spotify and its colleagues actually address the problems that are inherent in the distribution of classical music through streaming. One of them is metadata. As I said, it's almost impossible to find anything you would like to find. The second one is sound quality, which is nowhere near where it should be now, which has many explanations and people's internet connections and what have you. But it is a problem that has to be addressed at some stage if you want to have a real classical public doing it. And the third is the absolute, totally nonsensical distribution of the revenues as it is now, which is all going back to the old track thinking. Track is a track is a track. It should, a stream is a stream is a stream. It shouldn't be like that. And we have been very carefully cautioned not to blow our own horn here and make info advertisement. But that I say that we at eClassical, we actually have done away with all that. We don't sell music by tracks, we sell music by second. And that means that a long track costs more than a short track. If you buy a 20-second track, it will cost you all of 5 cents. If you buy a track for 40 minutes, it costs more. And I think that the distribution should not be per track, because that is a throwback to the pop market. It should be actually for how long you use the service. If it's a long track, pay more. Or pay a little bit less, little.
Or should you pay more for... I mean, should you pay more for Alban Berg than you should pay for Mozart?
No. It's a question of duration. duration and duration.
Okay. Would anyone else like to continue this for a couple of moments? We're just about at the end, but if any of the panel members have anything they'd like to add on this topic or another one?
For me, I just wanted to kind of go back to the metadata issue in particular, and in terms of sourcing new content. I think that, there's work to be done, but I think there's lots of people doing good work already, and I think the opportunity as well with streaming and with no barriers to entry there is that there's all this music to be discovered. And Spotify as an open source platform gives you and other developers the opportunity to do that. And that's what a few different labels have done, and X5 in particular have been very active there with their app on Spotify, which is called Classify. And it's been really, really effective for them. Not only did it increase just general consumption of classical music on Spotify, it increased their revenue significantly too, both from market share on Spotify and actually driving sales on platforms like iTunes as well. So again, it comes back to thinking, should you have a different, do you need to adjust the different distribution models? And I think it's also, you need to recognize that the different platforms, the different solutions out there serve many different purposes for different people. It's discovery, it's a social thing, or it could just be a way of finding music they want to buy later, or it's the be-all and end-all of their consumption. I don't think that needs to differ how you produce the music and deliver the music. However, the strategies you have to appealing to different types of users and recognizing that there are different types of collectors or consumers out there is key. And I think that's the kind of, me personally, I think that's where kind of marketing strategy will evolve to over the coming years.
Thank you. Okay, I think that we're just about out of time, and so please, again, thank you to all the panel members for participating and having a very, for me, interesting and enjoyable conversation. And please, let's open it up now for any questions from the audience. There's a gentleman here.
Is Spotify itself investing in improving the metadata problem, going more in the direction of the Nexus Music Library, for example, or are you just leaving it up to the apps, the app developers to solve that problem?
No, our content ops team are proactively working on a style guide. That means that we can have some consistency across the different metadata fields. So, we're committed to search being better. It's not just something that concerns labels. It's a problem for consumers as well. So yeah, it's an ongoing project.
And just a quick follow-up. Klaus Heimann announced that he's going to withhold Nexus new releases from Spotify. How do you feel about that?
I think, personally, I think that's a mistake, and it's a missed opportunity to get more people into your music.
Any other questions or comments from the audience? Please wait for a moment for the microphone.
I'm Oliver Siddle from Believe Digital. I had a presentation yesterday where I showed some stuff in a very cramped 15 minutes that might give some answers to the discussion here. I can show this to you right now. I did a label, just a random label, and have the statistics of streaming, that's the blue one, album sales, and single sales downstairs. This is what every label can do with us. And you will see if the argument was true that streaming kills sales, then the lines would shift and change, which they didn't. You even see the market entry of Spotify. And it's actually totally parallel. The only thing you can see is that streaming actually incites and inspires album sales. After streaming peaks, you see increasing album sales. So actually Spotify is the new radio, in my opinion.
Okay. This gentleman over here.
Has Deutsche Grammophon considered starting their own streaming in a try before you buy effort?
Sorry, an own streaming?
Yeah, roll your own.
An own streaming service?
Yes. Do your own. Have you thought about doing your own streaming service, which would?
No, not really. No, actually, we had a download store some years back where we offered streaming options, but we stopped with that. And
I actually used it.
Yeah, you used it.
The sound quality on the MP3s was terrible. You need to go over to FLAC completely.
Yeah, no, I think the technology is too advanced for a company like Deutsche Grammophon to drive this on a global basis. And it's not about, probably this is also a reason why many of the young people also now taking the opportunity of streaming services because it's so easy. It's easy access everywhere. You don't have to struggle with illegal files. How do I get this from my laptop to my iPhone, and how do I get it to work, and on so on. It's with these cloud services, you have all options, and it's easy access everywhere. And I think we, as a record label, we need to focus on our own on our own competence. And I mean, we are doing a lot of things in the digital world already. We just released an iPhone and iPad app with Beethoven 9, and we are also looking into producing an own app, Deutsche Grammophon app for Spotify. But we won't start an own streaming platform. This makes no sense for us.
Okay, any other questions?
You don't have to, you partly own Spotify.
You're talking about this little share we have?
Yes, I am. So something that has not been accorded to other labels. Only the majors were allowed to buy into Spotify at a rock bottom price. And Spotify pays differently to different right holders.
Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd try and clarify some of the conspiracy theories. The Merlin, the indie board that I think some of your content goes through is also an equity holder, and very happy with the rates they have from us as well.
Okay, this young woman has a question.
Hello, my name is Alejandra Castro. I'm representing composers in the Netherlands, music publisher. And I'm wondering, I understood that Spotify has kind of agreements with music societies, but how is it, how do you, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about these music rights and how are they shared, how do you say it? Well, how is it organized with protected music?
How do we pay songwriters, do you mean?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, again, we have to deal with the rights holders, so the collecting societies and publishers, and in the same we pay them on a monthly basis in the same way we do the recorded rights holders too. So again, I mean, I work more on the kind of operational side with labels. So in terms of the kind of ins and outs of the deals with publishers and collecting societies, I can't really clarify any kind of real detailed questions, but we can talk after, and I can try and get you some more details if you need.
Maybe just as a background piece of information, the streaming models generally have two types of income streams. One is a premium service, which someone can subscribe to, like you subscribe to a cell phone contract. And that revenue is split up in a certain way. And then there's the free services. And of course, there are many, many more people using the free services than the paid-for premium services. Those are basically financed by advertising income. And then I believe that advertising income is then split up through, how is that calculated? How is the split calculated in a very easy overall way?
It's obviously a very complex thing, but I mean, the kind of long and short of it is we look at all revenue coming in as well, and obviously kind of depending on where the stream's coming from can affect it as well. But again, I mean, every stream is accounted for, and we look at the overall revenue coming in and apply it accordingly to where the engagements happen.
Okay, I think we eventually have time for one last question, please, this gentleman.
Hi, I'm Brendan Walsh, a classical musician gone corporate. And what I find very interesting in the discussion here is sort of more the attitude from the classical music sector being, it shouldn't change, you know, can't we keep it the way it is? I might be exaggerating a little bit, and on the other hand, the sort of the lack of saying, hey, but this is a new opportunity, there must be loads and loads of business opportunities, which if we think about it, which we can tag into. And I was wondering, maybe you've even got suggestions for us where you say, well, you know what, it will open up indeed. Like, for example, if you say Spotify is the new radio, who are going to be these radio presenters? Who are going to be the ones curating it? And what kind of business could you actually get out of that?
Okay, Jonathan, maybe you would like to weigh in on this, but also perhaps other generating marketing as a marketing tool as well, that if the streaming income is yet in its infancy, can it motivate other sources of income through merchandising, concert ticket sales, and things of that nature.
I think that the most important thing that's common to all different digital exploitation is that it represents new opportunities. I totally understand also the need that exists to maximize the revenue opportunities and to know which ones are revenue opportunities and which ones are promotional is sometimes a very challenging thing to do in the digital world. But I do think that the opportunity is what we've all talked about, which is reaching more people and having a deeper engagement with the people who you do reach. And that's something which is totally possible now. And I don't actually get a sense that the classical music business is trying to protect. I mean, there's an element of that which is sensible, right? I mean, it's a huge part. The CD business is a very, very big business. Still, percentage of the business, we all wish it were a lot bigger. But I think the fact is it's understandable that there's a protective and sensible, that there's a protective part of the business. But I also think that most people I talk to in the classical business are very aware that the digital revolution, no matter what guise it is, represents a great opportunity to reach people in different ways.
Okay. Thank you all for coming, and enjoy the rest of Classical Next.